presentation on the screen. Good evening, everyone. My name is Sharon. I'm an associate planner with the planning department and the project lead for the Hillcrest Focused Plan Amendment. And tonight's presentation is on the Hillcrest LGBTQ+ historic context statement. And presenting tonight is myself, as well as Kelly Stanko, Development Project Manager with the Planning Department, who is the lead on the historic preservation component of the Hillcrest Focused Plan Amendment. Next slide. Just some housekeeping for tonight. I want to point out that the chat function will only be enabled during the public comment discussion portion of tonight's meeting for all of you to share your thoughts or ask questions. We want to ensure compliance with the Brown Act by not discussing non-agendized items, and we have received feedback that the chat has been very distracting. So out of respect to our presenter Kelly and to the subcommittee, we will only enable the chat during the public comment portion discussion of the meeting today. And the presentation is available right now on PlanHillcrestorg under the Meetings and Updates tab if you wish to have it up on your screen and follow along, or to reference in the future after tonight. And as a reminder, we are recording this presentation, and I will upload the recording and the chat log to the website following the meeting. And I'll pass it off to Kelly Stanko.
Gotta unmute myself. Okay, so thank you, Shannon. I appreciate the introduction. Again, my name is Kelly Stanko. I am a development project manager, and I'm in charge of the work of the historic preservation planning section here in the planning department. Today, we're going to go over primarily the historic context statement that we are preparing as part of the Focused Plan Amendment effort. I'm going to start with kind of an overview of the historic preservation strategy that we're implementing for the Hillcrest Focused Plan Amendment. There is a video that we put together on the PlanHillcrestorg website that you may have seen. I'll kind of go over that very quickly, kind of a condensed version of that, just to kind of refresh everybody on what it is we're doing with our 5-part historic preservation strategy. Then I'm going to talk a little bit about what a historic context is, what the purpose is, how we use it in planning, what it is not. Give you a brief introduction to the historic context statement we prepared in 2016 citywide for LGBTQ resources and history in San Diego, and then present the draft of the Hillcrest LGBTQ historic context statement, which kind of springboards off the citywide context statement and provides a more focused look at Hillcrest. Then we'll go over kind of the next steps, what we're looking for both from this subcommittee and the broader public in the weeks and months to come. And then move into subcommittee discussion, comments or questions, and then take a look at the next steps just for the broader Hillcrest Focused Plan Amendment, which I'll turn over to Shannon when we get to that point. So on this slide, this kind of shows 5 of the key objectives of the PlanHillcrest, the FPA: celebrating the legacy of the LGBTQ community, creating public spaces and parks, strengthening connections, supporting local businesses, and addressing housing needs. And of course, the work of our historic preservation strategy is serving that first objective of celebrating the legacy of the LGBTQ community in Hillcrest. So for the historic preservation strategy, as I mentioned, it has 5 parts. The first is the Hillcrest LGBTQ historic context statement. This will guide the evaluation and designation of buildings in Hillcrest that are important to the LGBTQ history, and as I said, build upon the citywide context that we prepared in 2016. And the purpose of a context statement, which I'll get into a little bit more, is to help us evaluate the existing built environment and designate resources that are significant. So it focuses on resources that still exist today, as opposed to resources that may have been lost. The second component is a multiple property listing. A multiple property listing is a mechanism to designate properties that have a shared significance. So an LGBTQ+ significance, for example. and facilitates the designation of those resources with less time and cost to the property owner or applicant for that designation, and streamlines the process. The third component is the evaluation of the Hillcrest Potential Historic District. This was identified in the Uptown Comprehensive Plan Update for Uptown as a potential historic district, and a recommendation of the plan. And one of the policies is to intensively evaluate the potential districts. So that's what we're doing. We're looking at the properties within this boundary to determine whether or not a district is in fact present, whether it's this boundary or a modified boundary, and what the period of significance in contributing and non-contributing properties would be if we find that the district is eligible. If the district is eligible and designated, the fourth component would be design guidelines that we would develop in concert with this group and the community, the LGBTQ community, the business community, and the broader community in Hillcrest, to kind of balance the historic preservation needs of the district with the economic needs of that area as a business district that we want to see continue to thrive. And the fifth and final component of our strategy is an LGBTQ heritage interpretive plan. This would be something that we would develop in partnership with the community, LGBTQ plus community, and other stakeholders to honor and celebrate the people, events, buildings, and sites, both existing and lost, because this isn't necessarily just about historic preservation. This component of it is about a broader acknowledgement and celebration of the history, utilizing the information in the context statements and other efforts, but then broadening that beyond historic preservation, interfacing with other planning disciplines, such as park planning, urban design, mobility, to create an urban environment that informs and celebrates the LGBTQ history of the community. Excuse me. So what is a historic context statement? A historic context statement is a historic preservation planning tool that provides guidance for identifying and evaluating historic buildings and sites. Which ones are significant and why, and what character features do they need to have, what level of integrity do they need to have to be eligible for historic designation. A context ties important historic events and people to the built environment, and typically follows a framework of providing a broad historical overview of its subject matter, identifying the themes within that subject matter that are important to the built environment, identifying what property types are associated with those themes, whether they're commercial, residential, office, maybe parks or sites, things of that nature. The eligibility standards, what standards the property needs to meet in order to be eligible for designation for an association with the theme, and a list of any known potential resources that have come up during the course of research for the context statement. The document is based on historic perspective. So in historic preservation, we have kind of a benchmark that we call a sufficient passage of time. Typically with National Register, that's 50 years, that you have to have 50 years that have passed for a resource to be eligible, unless you can demonstrate that it's of exceptional significance. The state and local registers don't have that 50-year threshold. Building or resource can be younger than that, but you have to have a sufficient passage of time to kind of be able to step back a little dispassionately, evaluate a resource within a broader context, and make a determination that it's significant. So that's a constraint of a historic context statement and of historic preservation that, again, won't be a constraint when it comes to something like our heritage interpretive plan, the fifth component of the strategy. A historic context statement is a living document that is updated as research and understanding grows. So time marches on, we learn more, we do gain that historic perspective and passage of time. And so the idea is these documents are updated with new information, new research, and continue to evolve as time goes on. A historic context statement is not a comprehensive history of its subject matter, as much as we may want it to be sometimes, to just kind of include everything that we know or think we know about a subject matter. Again, it has to be tied back to the built environment and its objective of helping us determine what resources within the built environment are worthy of historic preservation. And it's also not a static document. As I said, this historic context statements are something that evolves over time as our understanding grows. So how is a property determined to be historically significant and designated? Locally, a resource would be evaluated against the city's 5 criteria for designation, and a property need only meet one of the 5 criteria in order to be determined significant and designated. That designation action occurs by the Historical Resources Board. If it's designated, it can be appealed to the City Council, but typically the decision will rest with this Historical Resources Board of the city. The 5 designation criteria include criterion A, that a resource is a special element of the city or community's development, whether that's its social development, economic development, cultural development, architectural development, historical development, some aspect of the city's development. Criterion B is an association with a significant person or event. Criterion C is that a resource embodies the distinctive characteristics of a style of architecture or type or method of construction. Criterion D is being the work of a master, whether that's a master architect, builder, landscape architect, etc. And criterion E is that it is listed on or determined eligible for listing on the state or national register. The assumption there being if it was listed on or determined eligible for one of those higher level registers, then it would be eligible for our own register. Not all associated resources are eligible. So not every LGBTQ owned or associated, business or residence or whatever it may be will be eligible for designation. There must be a demonstrably important, it must be demonstrably important through research and comparative analysis to other similar property types of why this particular resource, whether it's a business, is maybe more significant than the average when you step back and do that research and comparative analysis. In doing that, you would consider contemporary ephemera, newsletters, flyers, letters, oral history, and input from community members and stakeholders, members of the LGBTQ plus community in this case, because again, with a culturally kind of based significance and a more recent past, it's going to be really important to get that information and perspective from the community that the resource kind of represents or reflects when making that determination. As I mentioned, in 2016, we undertook a citywide LGBTQ historic context statement. This was funded through a grant by the State Office of Historic Preservation. It identified several themes related to LGBTQ history citywide, and those included social life, community organizations, political activism, religion, LGBTQ media, and arts and culture. The resources were generally dated to the 1970s and 80s in areas such as Hillcrest, Pacific Beach, Ocean Beach, North Park, Golden Hill, and downtown. The property types associated with the various themes included places of social interaction, sites of political action and reaction, residents and offices, significant LGBTQ businesses, and sites associated with institutions and organizations. So we have built on that work that was done citywide to look more specifically at Hillcrest, starting with those themes and looking where those themes may still apply or not apply, but based on what's kind of on the ground in Hillcrest, and maybe where Hillcrest differs a little bit and maybe justifies themes that we did not include in the citywide context. So the first theme that was identified was LGBTQ plus social life in Hillcrest. Again, this kind of mirrors the citywide context. This theme discusses the importance of venues that allowed LGBTQ plus people to meet, socialize, educate, and share information, particularly prior to the gay liberation movement. It includes bars, clubs, coffee shops, bathhouses, movie theaters, etc. And the discussions that began in these venues evolved into the creation of dedicated community organizations and events, which contributed to the growing sense of community and solidarity within the LGBTQ community in Hillcrest. The property types that are typically associated with this theme would be commercial buildings and residential buildings. Sometimes these either operated out of people's homes or out of older building stock, older homes that had been converted to commercial uses, whether that's a coffee shop or small restaurant. And the criteria that properties would most likely be eligible under related to the theme would be our criterion A or B, which I talked about a few slides ago. Excuse me. Theme 2 is LGBTQ plus community organizations and political activism in Hillcrest. This theme discusses the importance of community organizations and political activism that emerged with the gay liberation movement. Support groups and advocacy groups such as the Center and San Diego Pride, political organizations such as Teddy Roosevelt Republican Club and San Diego Democratic Club and the Gay Activists of San Diego, medical organizations and support such as Our House, the AIDS Assistance Fund, and Priority Pharmacy were things that were mentioned within this theme. Property types include institutional, commercial, residential, and sites. And again, the criteria that these resources are most likely to be eligible under will be criterion A or B. With these culturally based contexts and resources, we're typically not looking at necessarily the architecture. A building could be architecturally significant, or it may not. It may be that its only significance is related to a cultural association and significance under A or B. But again, a resource need only be eligible under one criteria in order to be designated, and one that has a cultural significance and is designated under A or B is no less significant than a resource that is architecturally significant and designated under a criterion C or D for an association with a master. So you'll hear me say criterion A and B a lot as we go through these themes. The third theme is the LGBTQ plus media in Hillcrest. This theme discusses the importance of periodicals and other media in providing information relevant to the LGBTQ plus community, especially at a time when access to that information was not readily available and was limited. This includes newspapers, newsletters, and magazines. These provided a vital avenue for social networking, business advertisements, legal advice, and reporting on current events and politics, particularly those important to the LGBTQ plus community. Property types include institutional, commercial, and residential. And again, the criterion we're looking at is primarily criterion A with this theme. Theme 4, LGBTQ plus arts and culture in Hillcrest. This theme discusses the importance of performing arts, visual arts, and design and literature as a means of expressing tolerance for sexual diversity and as a platform for LGBTQ plus persons to tell their stories. These include theaters, bookstores, homes where you may have had poetry reads or other such things. Arts and culture venues served as meeting places and access points for literature, poetry, plays, and other works that were banned elsewhere. In addition, they helped form a communal network and facilitated political organization. Property types include commercial and residential structures, and the likely applicable criteria will be criteria A and B. Lastly, for theme 5, LGBTQ plus business and commerce, this is a theme that diverged a little bit from the citywide context because Hillcrest has so many LGBTQ plus businesses or business owners. It has more of a presence, concentrated presence in Hillcrest than elsewhere, and kind of warranted its own theme within Hillcrest. This theme discusses the importance of LGBTQ plus owned and or oriented businesses in fostering a sense of community and belonging and in revitalizing the aging community at the time when there had been a lot of flight to the suburbs in the post-war period, focus on shopping centers and auto-oriented shopping, and the business district within Hillcrest had been in decline. Associated businesses include bars, clubs, restaurants, coffee shops, bookstores, bathhouses, movie theaters, etc. The theme also discusses business associations such as the Greater San Diego Business Association, now the San Diego Equality Business Association, the Hillcrest Business Improvement District, and the Hillcrest Business Association. Property types include commercial and residential. Again, when referring to residential, it's looking more at older homes that may have been converted to commercial use, either prior to or during this period. And the applicable criteria would be A or B. In terms of next steps, we have posted the historic context statement, or are posting it potentially as we speak. I think Shannon's probably working on that or has it time to go. Posting the draft of the historic context to the PlanHillcrestorg website. We are seeking public input and comment on that draft through the end of August. We're specifically looking for feedback on the themes we've identified. Do you think they are accurate and reflective of the various aspects of LGBTQ history in Hillcrest as it relates, again, to the built environment? Any individuals and events important to the LGBTQ community. The context does identify a number of individuals and events, but again, if there's anything that was missed during the archival research and outreach that we did, please let us know. The location of buildings and events important to the LGBTQ plus community, particularly as they relate to the themes identified. Again, we include a list of known resources. We call it a study list in the context statement, things that would need to be evaluated potentially in the future. And again, we're also looking at doing that multiple property listing of LGBTQ plus resources. And so buildings and sites that are identified as part of that could potentially be listed as well. So that information is really valuable to us as well. Once we get that information, the historic context statement will be updated again to include additional edits from staff. I wanted to get this draft of the context out to the public for review at a point where it was far enough along that I felt comfortable with the themes that had been identified and the research that had been done, but not so far along that the public felt like they couldn't have meaningful input on this. So there are still edits that staff is going to be asking for. There's input that we're going to receive from the public. And you'll note, unfortunately, this current draft doesn't have historic photos, maps, tables, illustrative examples. Those will all be coming in a future draft. Again, I wanted to make sure I got this document out to the public at a good point in time where we had enough research, but we weren't too far along that we couldn't follow up on the input that we received from the public. Work on the historic context statement will kind of be wrapped up this fall after we get the input and work on the final revisions. And will inform the other aspects of the historic preservation strategy that I talked about at the beginning of the presentation, the other four aspects of what we're doing. The Hillcrest Potential Historic District is currently under evaluation. I don't have the results of that work yet, but can follow up and let folks know what the progress is on that and what the findings of the intensive survey are. The LGBTQ plus history and cultural interpretive plan. Again, this will be a really exciting opportunity for us to kind of go beyond the confines of historic preservation, beyond that sufficient passage of time, beyond the requirement that something kind of essentially still be physically present, to take the celebration and the acknowledgement of LGBTQ history and culture up through the present day, to acknowledge things that may not be present anymore, may have been lost or demolished or substantially changed, and just find hopefully wonderful and creative ways to celebrate and acknowledge that history throughout Hillcrest, whether it's walking tours, public art, banners, public trails, things like that. We really are looking forward to hearing the public's input on different ways that we can acknowledge and celebrate the history and culture of Hillcrest, again, not only through historic preservation, but more broadly. The kickoff for that will be later this year, beginning of 2022. We're still kind of working on the scheduling and timelines of that. And again, will involve extensive input from the LGBTQ plus community and other stakeholders. And there's the note about being able to celebrate history beyond the confines of historic preservation efforts. So with that, that concludes my presentation. Both the context, as I said, will be posted to the PlanHillcrestorg website for people to review. It's about 43, 45 pages long in total. And then the the input, we'll be collecting input through a online survey, which we will have up on the PlanHillcrestorg website by the end of next week. So you guys will have a jump start on reviewing it before the survey goes out.
Thank you, Kelly. And I did put the link to the PlanHillcrestorg website. It's on the tab, the Meetings and Updates tab. It's currently on the site live right now. So we can pass it over to Chairman Roy to lead.
All right.
Where you would like to lead this discussion.
We'll start with comments from the public. And then after we've heard all those comments, then we'll go to the subcommittee members. And again, if you're a newly elected member of the board, you're welcome to make a comment, but the Brown Act essentially says we cannot be forming opinions or policy or statements or anything with more than more than the minimum the 8 people of the board. So limit your comments if you feel you must make a comment or ask a question. If you are not a member of the subcommittee, the general public, please let us. We want to hear from you. This is your opportunity. This is why we have subcommittee meetings. All right. It looks like Eddie's got his hand up. Why don't we start with Eddie?
Hi, everyone. Again, my name is Eddie Renoso. I'm the Executive Director of the Quality Business Alliance. Our website is thinkeba.org. That's THINKEBA.org. I'm also the newly elected president of the San Diego LGBTQ Historic Task Force. My comment for this is there's a lot of discussion that centers around LGBT history, specifically to Hillcrest. And our organization has been working on a plan to implement a larger historic heritage walk that is more national and global history, while also incorporating local history. As this moves forward, I want to make sure that we're not limiting our historic context to just Hillcrest specifically, or even citywide. You know, there's Pacific Beach, there's Chi-Chi's downtown. So there's a lot to consider. And I just want to make sure that however the committee moves forward, that all of that is considered. Ultimately, Hillcrest is a destination because there's always going to be a need for a 16-year-old kid who's coming out to come out and feel safe in a space that is theirs. Hillcrest has been that for a lot of people, and I hope that you take that into consideration moving forward. Thank you.
Thank you for your comments. Let's see who's next. Charles.
Hi, so I'm board member emeritus of Lambda Archives. I'm not here as a Lambda Archives board member emeritus, but I was involved with the 2016 historic context statement. I've lived in San Diego since 1975. I'm also on the board of trustees of the San Diego History Center. I'm not here for that as well. So I have 2 questions that I put in the chat. One, if you could show again that the area that this historic context statement will focus on, I think that would be appreciative of me. And also, I wonder where religious organizations, if any, fall into the area of the context statement would fit in, which one of the themes that they may fall in. My analysis and research into historic sites, particularly LGBTQ sites in the city, may not have uncovered religious organizations in the early days in the heart of Hillcrest. Dignity kind of grew up out of Santee, et cetera, and there may have been some Jewish-related organizations, Mormon, et cetera, but I have not fully researched that. So those are my 2 questions: to show the historic context statement area, and then where might religious organizations, if there are any that have fallen into that district, would fall in which theme? Thank you.
All right, thanks for your comments. We'll be answering everything at the end. Marcella, I think I saw you next.
Yes, thank you, Roy. I guess I have two questions and a comment. I want to echo Eddie's comments that I do think there are a lot of areas outside of Hillcrest that are important. And I say this as somebody who has many family members and children that are part of the LGBTQ community. So I wanted to make sure that we do take those into consideration. A couple questions were, I was trying to figure out if the Hillcrest district is different than the LGBTQ district. So that's one question. The second one, and I think, Kelly, you may or may not have answered this at the end, I'm not sure, is will we know the properties that are actually the actual specific structures or properties that are being considered within the context, within the historic context district? And then also at one point during the Uptown plan, during the update process for the original Uptown community plan, we had actually talked and discussed about trying to do sort of an LGBTQ walk for, you know, because like, for example, you mentioned some areas, you know, Kelly, that like the building may have had, you know, some significance because of some events that happened there, but the building itself is nothing remarkable. And rather than maybe designating the building to somehow honor it with, you know, some sort of interpretive walk, you know, or something like that. And I know there's other places like Chicago that have done this. So I don't know if that's been considered, where maybe, again, the building's not anything remarkable, but the events that happen there are, and maybe there's a way to memorialize that somewhere in the public right of way where it's more visible to people and more evident. So thank you, Roy.
Thanks for your comments. I believe, Amy, I saw you next. Why don't you give your comments?
Thank you, Roy. Amy Hayes with Save Our Heritage Organization and also a previous board member. I have just a couple of questions. So I want to say thank you to Kelly and everyone for doing this and getting this out and just giving the public the opportunity to review this, and just know that we would want to be able to be involved. So thank you for doing that. I'm excited to review this. And then I just also want to note that I'm very excited to see the multiple property listing ordinance moving ahead. And I'm just curious on a little more detail on that, when you think that will go through or start to go through the review process. Ultimately, I understand that needs to be approved by council, but maybe what is that review process that it will go through? I'd definitely be interested in an update on the district survey, and then also what the boundaries are and what you're looking at. And then also just something to bring up, I realize this is a much larger topic, but mitigation is ultimately something we're going to have to think about. And I think Marcella was kind of getting at that a little bit too. So, you know, how is that done appropriately in some of these cases? And how do we understand the significance of these buildings when the significance isn't on the architecture? So I think we should have some of those larger conversations with the community. I think that would be helpful. And then last, I just want to bring up that a year or two ago, there were some development incentives for historically designated properties that were approved and updated in the land development code. And so I just wonder if there's any additional thought as to, I realize there's some design guidelines and some mechanisms that you're including in this. And so maybe some specific development incentives that help retain the character of this area would be helpful. And I'm not necessarily sure what those are, but I'm sure that they can be figured out. So those are just some of my thoughts, and thank you for this opportunity.
Thanks for your comments. Sharon, I think I saw you next.
Hello.
Yep.
Yes, I have a couple of different questions and observations. I want to start by saying I've been following Eddie Renoso's the walks, heritage walks that he's been putting together over the years, and I think it's an excellent way of telling history and putting it where the people are to make it accessible, make the information accessible. And it's adaptable over time. It can be changed. It's an excellent program. And I know that there's a lot of emphasis here on getting, using buildings to tell history, but this doesn't seem very effective. It hasn't been very effective in other ways in telling cultural history, where the building doesn't say anything. I took the Lambda Archives Heritage Walk some years ago when they were still doing it. It wasn't not very many people on it, but they didn't need buildings. They would be telling stories. They would say something used to be here, but then it used to be over there one time, and then it was another place another time. So it's mostly telling stories, and they didn't need to actually have control of the buildings. I also had another question for Mr. Kaminsky. I've wondered why the Lambda Archives has never written a book about the history of the LGBTQ community in San Diego. Other cities have done this. You can find online books in other cities. And the archive has information. It has all those wonderful pictures. I'm just surprised no one's ever done it. Is there, okay, I think I've covered all my questions now. Thank you.
Thank you, Sharon. Amanda, I think I saw you next.
Awesome, thank you. And thank you, Kelly, for that presentation. That was very informative. I just had a comment to kind of echo a little bit what Sharon said, but I love this idea of preserving history, not just through buildings, but through other opportunities, whether that's murals or whether that's plaques or events that happen through our annual Pride. I love the idea of having themes and really thinking beyond just buildings and rethinking some buildings and building new opportunities, new buildings, new architecture, and new ways to really be historic. The one question I do have is I wonder if you've given any thought to brainstorming movements or moments, excuse me, moments or people throughout San Diego's Hillcrest history of where you know, like some names can fit. You know, we think about the Joyce Beer Community Center. They're over in the hub, and she was a champion for, you know, neighborhood revitalization and the LGBT community. Are there other people? Are there other, you know, especially when we talk about BIPOC, LGBTQ, that's so many acronyms. You know, thinking of different ways that we can kind of really honor the history beyond just thinking about buildings. You know, a really cool bench with bus stops, something cool on the bike lanes. You know, I love the crosswalk that's over there where the pride flag is. Thinking about innovative ways like that to really add some historical content. Yeah, but great presentation. Thank you.
Thanks for your comments. Bill, I think you were next.
Thank you very, very much, Kelly. Very wonderful presentation. I look forward to seeing the documentation online. A couple of points I'd like to make is the one that was alluded to about the area involved being more the central core. I feel that there's a much greater opportunity with the with this Focused Plan Amendment. I mean, I was part of the you know, the process of the Pride Plaza, of the crosswalks over at Normal and University, and Normal Street itself has a wonderful, rich history. And I feel that this is an opportunity to not only embrace the wonderful and important aspects of the LGBTQ, but also the entire history of the Uptown area. One point that I would also make is there was an issue a number of years ago, probably 5-7 years ago, on the North Park side of Park Boulevard on El Cajon and Florida, where sort of in the dead of night, a very important meeting place of the LGBT was torn down and is now I'll call it the H.G. Fenton property at Florida and El Cajon. And if I recall, they decided, well, we tore it down, but we'll put something there, a plaque, you know, dedicate a drink to that. There's going to be a lot of development that goes along with this Focused Plan Amendment, and I think we need to be very careful to protect both the LGBTQ properties and history and a variety of the other histories as well, particularly along Normal Street. Thanks, Roy.
Thank you. All right, Lou, I think you can speak next.
Thank you. Thanks for the presentation, Kelly. I read the 2016 citywide context statement, and it was, you know, so fascinating, well done and well researched. I'm really looking forward to seeing how you dig deep on the Hillcrest portion of that and see in your draft. So it's great that we'll have time to review that, and I'm looking forward to it. I know how carefully you do this work. Just a couple of things I wanted to comment on and ask about. One, we're the this is a meeting of the PlanHillcrest Subcommittee. You're talking about a potential historic district for Hillcrest, as well as the multiple property listing that wouldn't be about the site itself, but about the an enclosed borders, but about a number of different properties. But PlanHillcrest, as you know, does not include parts of Hillcrest, including parts like, for example, where the flame is. That's one of those sites that was talked about in the overall context statement and probably will be in the Hillcrest context statement. So I'm wondering how you want us, and how you, in doing the PlanHillcrest, the piece of this, are looking at Hillcrest as a whole, and working with those different sites, or if they're part of it, not part of it. That's one question. The second is, I really appreciate your emphasis on making the point that the criteria can include architectural distinction, but that's not a requirement for an historical designation. I appreciate all the comments that have been made and ideas of other ways to recognize historic events and people and activities in Hillcrest. But I would be very disappointed, and I think it would be a disservice to the community if we ended up with plaques and not places being preserved. That the importance of place, and I think Bill sort of was speaking to this too, is part of what creates the character of Hillcrest, and having just markers and not having the places that go with them. I too have done those kind of historic walks, and it is informed by the fact that this is a real thing, can be. And so I think that's important. And also that these are not unrelated. The architectural history and design can be related to the events and purposes and people that were involved. Finally, and this is my, maybe you'll want to comment on that. And finally, this is my most important question. You talked about how you've got this balancing act, which has got to be tough. I respect you for taking on this challenge of looking at the historic value of properties, particularly having to do with LGBTQ history in Hillcrest and in the PlanHillcrest area in particular, but also the economic development interests and concerns that are at stake. And I'm wondering, as the historic person, the person responsible for making recommendations on the historic park, are you being influenced? Are you making decisions about what you will be recommending and not recommending based on that perceived economic development potential, need, whatever? Or are you saying, you know, that someone else will do the balancing act, will put out what the historic issues are? So that's my last question. And thank you again very much for the presentation and for giving us time to review the draft, which should be great.
Thanks, Lou. Matt Wallstrom, I think I saw you next.
Yes, hi. I do want to, I'm glad that Bill Ellig and Lou Railing, actually, I just want to echo what they said. I'll go ahead and I'll put in the chat some background on this. I am particularly concerned that, as is been complained about in San Francisco, with, you know, the Mission District there, in their historic district, and others, that that there is this push to have plaques take the place of places, so that, you know, there is not the same experience of place by having, you know, there's a big difference between going into #1 Fifth Avenue and seeing all the gorgeous woodwork there and having that intimate space, and seeing a 10-story high-rise with a plaque saying, yeah, a bar used to be here. That's not an experience that people don't go you don't go to visit Washington, D.C. or any other historical place to look at a plaque of what used to be there on top of a high, in front, pasted to the front of a high rise. So I really want to caution against falling into the trap of, accepting that as, as an adequate, substitute for the actual real lived experience and the actual places that are still around. Thank you.
All right, thanks for your comments, Matt. Michael.
Hey, Kelly, thanks for a great presentation. One of the things that you mentioned in there was the gay liberation movement. It's important to recognize that the LGBT community and its place in a city is more about movement. As a community, we tended to settle where we felt welcomed, where we could gather in a place that felt safe. And so initially that was downtown, that was Pacific Beach. It moved to other parts of the city. It has certainly passed through Hillcrest most recently. And I think we'll find that because the oppression that existed when Hillcrest was a place where we gathered is no longer as prevalent, that the community is dispersing across the city. And so it's important that we recognize that sense of movement and that sense of event over the sense of place, because the places will change. That doesn't mean that there aren't specific places with historic context, but it means that we need to be sure and capture the sense of movement and the sense of why we would gather in specific places at specific times. Thanks.
Okay, thank you for your comments. I don't see any other general public with their hands raised or anything. So I will let I'll ask the city staff to respond to any comments they feel that they want to respond to before we go to the subcommittee.
Okay. Yes, no, I'd be happy to. And there were some comments that kind of repeated through different speakers, kind of in different forms. So I'm going to try and hit just about everything I can. I won't necessarily go totally in order of speaker because sometimes these, like I said, these issues are kind of grouped. So let me go back a little bit. One of the things that came up was, Lord, all my animations are going to go backwards. Let me see if I can. Let's see. Can I jump slides?
Kelly, I believe if you go to see all slides, then you can just jump straight to the one that you want.
Thank you. I'm rusty on that. Okay. So let's take a look at this one. So in terms of this idea of the boundary and what are we looking at, for most of these efforts, for the context statement, for the multiple property listing, and for the heritage and interpretive plan, we are looking at the broader boundary of Hillcrest that coincides with the Focused Plan Amendment area. The reason for that is, there does need to be a nexus with the document that we're producing with the update itself. And so the boundary for the context statement, the multiple property listing, and the interpretive plan will be the entire Focused Plan Amendment area. In terms of the historic district and the potential design guidelines, this is where we're looking at a narrower area at the potential district that was identified during the Uptown CPU. And that's bounded by 1st Avenue on the west, Washington to the north, 6th Avenue to the east, and Pennsylvania to the south. Within that boundary, we are looking at whether that area is eligible as a historic district, either for its architecture and or for its association with the LGBTQ plus community. If it is found eligible and is designated, this is the area where we would be looking at design guidelines. And again, this is the area that we are evaluating. It could be that our conclusion is that it's not eligible. It could be that it's eligible, but it's a different boundary. We're still kind of working through that. But if it is eligible and it is designated, this is also the boundary that we would be looking at for the historic district design guidelines. The question came up of, this notion we had of balancing the historic preservation of LGBTQ plus history with the economic vitality of the community, and whether economic considerations are factoring into our determination as to what is historically significant. And it's not. Our first question is the resource eligible? Is the district eligible? Is an individual building outside of the district eligible? But particularly as it relates to this historic district, I mean, a conversation that is had throughout jurisdictions with historic preservation, because I've talked to preservation programs across the country, and they all kind of grapple with this idea of, when you have a resource that is significant based on its cultural association and not its architecture, what is the appropriate treatment? Is the standards, the US Secretary of the Interior standards for the treatment of historic properties, which are kind of the traditional metric that's used and is perhaps a little bit more architecturally based, is that the appropriate standard to use? Are we as concerned with materials, with massing, as we are if something is culturally based as opposed to architecturally based? And that's where that dialogue with the community will be important, both in terms of the LGBTQ community and the business community, of what is it we're trying to preserve and how. So if this district is eligible, what are we trying to preserve and how? And is more alteration of materials acceptable? Is, typically, we're sort of concerned with massing and overwhelming a historic resource. Is that as much of a concern if it's not historically significant? It may not be. So it's not that the economic concerns are factoring into our determination of what is eligible, but there is a valid discussion to be had when something is culturally significant as opposed to architecturally significant, of what and how do you preserve and expand and alter and change and allow to grow. There was a comment asking about religious organizations. I think that was Chuck's comment or question. There is a theme in the citywide LGBTQ context statement related to religious organizations. We did not carry that over into Hillcrest because we didn't find any that were specific within this boundary. And that's something we want input on. If we miss something in the research, please let us know, because we can look at either carrying that theme back over into Hillcrest, or if it doesn't really have a significant presence, but it maybe ties to organizations, supportive organizations or things, we can look at maybe tying it into one of those themes. Going beyond Hillcrest, again, we do have constraints, a couple of constraints there. One is in terms of funding and timeframes, there needs to be a nexus with our Focused Plan Amendment and our Focused Plan Amendment area. We don't really have the latitude to go beyond that in terms of what we're looking at. Also, from a historic preservation perspective, again, with a context statement, we're tying it to the built environment of the area we're looking at. Now, again, this LGBTQ plus heritage interpretive plan is something that I'm particularly excited about, because that really kind of throws off the shackles of historic preservation a bit, in terms of, if there's a connection between this place in Hillcrest and, a global movement, or, another place in the world, we can absolutely make those ties through the interpretive plan and celebrate it that way. But it's kind of where that fits in this strategy. And it would be more in the interpretive plan as opposed to the historic context, which is really about the built environment in Hillcrest. Will we know specific properties? So there are properties that are identified in the study list for the context statement. So there will be properties that will be flagged there for future evaluation. We will know at the end of this process whether this district is eligible and which ones would contribute versus not contribute if it is eligible. And we are also looking at a handful of properties to include in the multiple property listing that goes forward. So once we flag which properties would be eligible, we'll do some outreach to property owners and hopefully find some who are excited about the opportunity of doing some of this more groundbreaking historic preservation work in terms of LGBTQ resources. See, scanning my notes, again, related to the multiple property listing, that will be moving kind of on track with the Focused Plan Amendment itself. We do have to look at getting just sort of like enabling regulations in place that just allow us to set up a multiple property listing. So that will kind of be its own thing. But the multiple property listing and all of these 5 components of the strategy will track with the Focused Plan Amendment and be all kind of packaged up together with that as it moves through the process. In terms of development incentives mitigation, I do think that would all be a wonderful discussion to have when we start talking about the design guidelines. Let's see.
All right, well, we can come back if you think of something else. So I want to get to the board now.
Okay, thank you.
All right, Matt, I saw you first.
All right, thank you again to echo. Thank you, Kelly, for the presentation and the work of the city planners. So a couple of things. First of all, certainly I would like to see, the planning department work closely with Eddie and Charles and some of the organizations that they do represent. They're going to bring a lot to the table here that's going to be helpful in this process, I'm sure. Especially as Eddie talked about with the walk, I think that is going to be a primary piece of bringing tourism into the Hillcrest area and incorporating a lot more to help, again, the businesses and the growth of Hillcrest in general. I know we're a little early from the standpoint of not necessarily designating what buildings, what places, so on and so forth. But I think to echo a little bit that I've heard on both sides of that, at the end of the day, I think we're talking about a mixture of things. I think we're talking about some plaques in some sorts where a building might be non-existent, be it a plaque, be it creating LGBT art-oriented structures that help to bring across the history and some of the struggles and the political triumphs that happened through Hillcrest over the years. So I think incorporating that with some of the existing buildings, but then as we've talked about in previous meetings here, I think one of the key aspects to that, which I believe Amy said as well, is to retain and capture the character of Hillcrest. We've talked about what is the character of Hillcrest. As you get some input from the public regarding the historical preservation aspect, what is it about Hillcrest? What is the design aspect that would bring across the history of the LGBTQ community that we could then incorporate into design? One of the things as Eddie creates the walk, well, we're talking about a lot bigger setbacks potentially down University. Well, that's going to give some opportunity for art installations, for things along those lines, which will help celebrate the past of this community. So I think we can bring that character in through both the transit ideas by having that greater walking space, but also through the design ideas, where if you're incorporating an older building, you can create and requirements in the design process to keep the past there while still incorporating the growth of the future to revitalize Hillcrest through the focus plan. So I do see a mixture of those happening. A lot will come out, and I look forward to seeing what the public's input is. And as we get a little more into the specifics of this in future discussions, but I do thank you, and that's my 2 cents. Thanks.
Thanks, Matt. Tom, you were next.
Yeah, thank you. I'm happy to see that Kelly Stonko is managing this project, because I know Kelly is highly respected in historic resources. And I want to thank Amy Hayes from Soho for joining, and also Charles Kaminsky, Lambda Archives. And I hope that both of those people will stay involved, because they're the experts. I'm not, and So I want to listen and learn to the people who know what's going on. Thank you.
Thanks, Tom. Brer, I think you were next.
Hey, everyone. I'm going to beat a dead horse and just say that was a great presentation. And I really appreciate the thoroughness of what you posted online compared to some of the other city consultants who presented in the past. It's thorough and it's professional, and it's quite refreshing to see such just an awesome professional approach. Now, I would like to just talk a little bit about architecture, not a lot, maybe 1 minute, you know, and how our cultural memory is tied to the places that are around us and how that cultural memory fades over time. And I noticed that the gentleman from Lambda Archives was here, and you know, they know is better than anyone how, as time passes, the cultural memory and its ties to certain places fades. And, you know, the buildings that are remembered as being associated with a famous person or a particular event are usually ones where the architecture has come to symbolize that organization or that person. And people link that building with that association in their mind. And the building, in a way, embodies the activity and the people that were there. And that doesn't happen in every place. Now, as you know, more than anyone, I'm just saying this for the benefit of everyone else, it's standard practice in the historic profession to celebrate and retain that connection to history in other ways aside from the building, when the building doesn't represent the person or the activities that took place there, through interpretive plaques, diagrams, storyboards, statues. There are many ways to maintain that connection to history in our neighborhood, aside from preserving what may be a deteriorated or architecturally substandard, or even a building that has been modified and has lost its historic context relative to what took place there. And so I know that this is a fine line that you were referring to when you said people are debating this. And so I have confidence that, you know, you'll come up with a way to establish criteria that separates architecture that is tied to a person or an event versus just buildings where things happened. I'm confident in that, and I'd encourage you to at least try and define that in this document so that we have criteria in places where that connection to the past has been lost and is only preserved in archives or through tours, perhaps receive less importance architecturally as far as preserving that building. Now, when it comes to the Hillcrest Historic District, there's been a push for a while now to designate the Hillcrest core as an architecturally significant place. And I have one concern in that you know, cultural designations will be used to validate this historic district and thereby place a set of design criteria over the entire area when perhaps only a few buildings in that area are historically relevant. And so I would like to ask you to set up some sort of definition or criteria for these design criteria that you mentioned. Sorry to say that word twice. So that if you do find this to be a historic district based on architectural, persons of interest, and cultural interest, that you're not applying design guidelines to the area when only a small portion of them are architecturally significant. I know the area well, and I know much of it has been redeveloped. And even in your map, there are large parking lots and modern buildings and 80s and 90s redevelopments, which really have no business having architectural guidelines applied to them as, you know, trying to recreate some sort of sense of history. But all that said, I just want to say this is probably the most exciting part of the Plan Hillcrest project. And I'm really excited to see like how this shakes out. I know that the San Diego Bicycle Coalition, and like Eddie said, he's creating a historical walk. There are many people who want to tell this story, and I'm really excited to see how we can enable that and encourage that and like maintain that tie to the neighborhood's past in a way that is appropriate and that it deserves. So that's the end. Thanks a lot.
Thanks, Brer. Do we have other subcommittee members that haven't spoken that would like to speak?
Hi, Roy. It's Gail. I'd like to say something.
Sure.
I think, thank you again, like everybody said, for the presentation. I'm really excited about this project. I would hope that once this designation or whatever takes place, that that the mobility issues around this area get addressed, where you're not having to walk around and, dodge traffic, especially on University Avenue. It'd be wonderful if this area could be made more pedestrian friendly and make it more easy to walk in this area. So that's my only comment. Thank you.
Thanks, Gail. Any other subcommittee members? All right, I don't think we're over our numbers, so I can speak. I think this sort of takes off of where Gail was, but maybe in a different direction. What makes us different than, say, like Little Italy? So I had to drive my roommate down to Little Italy because he got a job down there, and he can't drive his truck there because there's no parking. So I had to drive and drop him off, and it was a nightmare getting there, and there is no parking. And that's my concern, is people keep saying Hillcrest should look like Little Italy. But Little Italy is great for the people that live in Little Italy, and that's what I was told, that don't worry about the fact that I don't go to Little Italy anymore, because there's plenty of people in Little Italy to serve the businesses in Little Italy. What's different here about Hillcrest is we serve a greater gay community. And so when we have to remember in our transportation plans that we have to be accessible to a much larger community than you would have to be accessible in some of the other parts of the city where they're happy to be their own little neighborhood. So that's the perspective I have on what the gay neighborhood really means. It's, if you look historically, whether you're talking about DuPont Circle in Washington, D.C., or Rehoboth in Delaware, or many cities around the country, they all popped up around a bar. The bar was in the worst area of the city because that's the only place that they're allowed to have it. And so we started in bad neighborhoods and we revitalized those neighborhoods. And that's sort of the history of the community. And how you capture that is going to be a challenge. But that would be my comments on this. Thank you. Shannon, you want to talk about what our next steps are and where we're going and what's going on?
Yes. All right, so for some next steps for continuing to fall and into August, or sorry, continuing into summer and into fall of this year, we will be taking August off from a meeting, but our next meeting will be on September 16th. And we will have a presentation on more refined land use and urban design concepts. And then I know we mentioned this in the last meeting. We also aim to launch an online community engagement tool this fall to gain broader community input on the different land use and mobility scenarios that will be refined from last month's meeting. So that's pretty much it for next steps. Kelly, before we end the meeting, did you want to add any more comments or respond to any of the feedback from the board members before we end the meeting?
I mute myself. I think I've covered everything that I wanted to cover. Just a reminder, so the context statement is on the PlanHillcrestorg website now. Our survey for folks to provide feedback will be up by the end of next week, and folks will have till the end of August to comment on that. So please do, we value your input, we need your input. And if you have any questions in reviewing the document that you would like answered, feel free to reach out to me. My contact information was on the first slide, and this PowerPoint will also be posted to the website. So thank you all so much for your time, for your comments. And I look forward to continue working with you. I'm really excited about this project too. So.
Just as a note to everyone, we'll probably continue to use the Zoom meeting format while the city has all this content to present to us, and we'll try to move into a live meeting format when it's time for us to actually fight about coming up with positions on things. That, at least that's my perspective at this point, and it can be discussed more at our regular board meeting.
Sounds good. Thank you, everyone. And also happy Pride.
Yes, happy Pride. Thank you.
Happy Pride.
Right. Good night.
Good night.
Thank you all so much.